New Scotland Yard, London, England, an address that is known worldwide. Headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, guardians of the capital city against crime. In the marbled lobby, an eternal flame burns in memory of those members of the civil staff who have given their lives in both world wars, together with a book of honour in which is recorded the names of police officers who have lost their lives in the course of duty. And in a quiet corner of the building, a place where legend becomes fact that I would like to tell you about. But it is for the Deputy Commissioner to invite you in.
Here in the Yard is one of the police museums that many have heard of, but few have visited. It's an unusual museum and started life in 1875, when it was decided to keep certain items of property seized in connection with crime to instruct the young detectives of the then relatively new Detective Department of Scotland Yard. It was not too long before the press gave this collection of somewhat macabre artifacts the unofficial title of the Black Museum. And so it's remained over the years, exhibiting the darker side of human nature, instructing the professional policeman and the lawyer, and intriguing the layman by its very name and remoteness. We've never opened the doors of the Black Museum to the general public, and all visits have been by way of invitation and always highly prized. The exhibits range from the apparently insignificant to the spectacular, and from the hardly known to the infamous, whose names are known throughout the world. They have in common one thing: supreme importance to the history of crime and the criminal, as you will see.
The old museum creates the theme for the entrance to the new. The gaslight, the Victorian fireplace, war posters of the period. But now the tables display the modern weapons, knives, koshies, knuckle dusters, all presented as court exhibits, and now a frightening reminder of the violence of man. In contrast, the cabinet in the corner catches the eye. A violin in its case, property of one Charles Peace of Sheffield, amateur musician, professional burglar, eventually convicted murderer. A strange court exhibit? Not at all, for his amateur interests served his professional trade. Late at night, out came the violin, and the case became his toolbox. Into it he carefully packed these pliers, the screwdriver, these picklocks, this tallow, oil lamp, and an ingenious folding ladder. And Charles Peace was ready to go to work. What officer of the law, seeing the scurrying little figure clutching a violin case, would imagine him to be other than a musician hurrying home from a concert? His undoing? What else but a woman? In spite of a deformed jaw and pronounced limp, both legacies of accidents in his youth working in a Sheffield steel mill, plus a missing finger lost in a gun accident when he turned criminal, Charlie Peace had a way with women. He certainly had his way with a neighbour's wife, Kate Dyson, and when Arthur Dyson moved his family to be rid of him, he tracked them down. On Wednesday night, the 29th of November, 1876, by the light of a tallow, he lurked in their backyard, waiting for Kate to go to the privy. On seeing him, she screamed. Arthur Dyson rushed out and Peace shot him dead. This is the poster that the police issued, and £100 was no mean sum in 1876. Charlie Peace was on the run. He escaped to London. He disguised himself, adopting these spectacles and fashioning this false arm with a hook to cover his missing finger. For a year he led a respectable life by day as a Mr. Thompson. But at night, the tools were tucked into the violin case, and Charlie Peace took to the rooftops. It was in the early hours of Thursday, the 10th of October, 1887, that Police Constable Edward Robinson noticed a flickering light in the window of a mansion. He went to investigate and pursued the figure he saw scuttling across the garden. Peace swung round and 3 shots missed, The fourth hit the policeman's arm, but he held in there until two more policemen paralyzed Peace's gun arm with blows from their truncheons. These letters were written by Charles Peace in the condemned cell, the last one dated the 25th of February. Whether it was ever posted, we don't know. For at 8 a.m. that morning, he was hanged. A macabre reminder that until 1969, a British judge could still don the black cap and pronounce that the prisoner shall be taken from this court to a place of execution and be hanged by the neck until dead. In 1847, this is the noose that was placed around the neck of George Platts, condemned to death for the murder of a man called Collis. In 1896, Amelia Dyer suffered the same fate. She was a mass murderer of children. The thickness of the rope, strangely, not differentiating between man and woman. It was the choice of the executioner who had studied his subject for some while through a peephole in the condemned cell. This pretty blonde was the last woman to be hanged in Britain, Ruth Ellis, whose name has taken its place in the annals of crimes of passion. 28-year-old Ruth was managing the Little Club in London's West End, with an apartment over the shop, as it were, when she met and fell in love with one of the customers, racing driver David Blakely. Blakely moved in, but his bad behavior lost her job and, of course, the apartment. He continued to date Ruth for some time, but their quarrels got worse and worse. In April of that year, their relationship reached its dramatic climax. Outside a pub in Hampstead, a suburb of London, it was the Easter holiday weekend, Blakely had promised to spend it with Ruth. He stood her up. She tracked him down to the Magdala pub and waited for him to come out. When he did, she leveled this gun and emptied all 6 chambers. In court, charged with the murder of David Blakely, her defense attorney gave a spirited plea for mitigating circumstances. But the prosecutor had one question that sealed her fate. When you fired the revolver, what did you intend? Ruth replied, I intended to kill him. The jury took 14 minutes to bring in a verdict of guilty.
Tuesday, the 12th of July, 1955. At 9 a.m. this morning, Ruth Ellis was hanged at Holloway Prison, while over 1,000 men, women and children waited or prayed outside.
This is the report of the surgeon who carried out the post-mortem, certifying her death. Her execution caused such a public outcry that Parliament had to take notice. On a free vote, the House of Commons resolved that this House believes that the death penalty no longer accords with the needs or true interest of a civilized society. But in spite of the public sympathy for Ruth Ellis, the House of Lords rejected it. And it took 14 years until 1969 for the will of the people to prevail, and for it to be impossible for another Ruth Ellis to be legally put to death. Her gun, now an exhibit in the Black Museum at Scotland Yard. This was the teller's window in Barclays Bank in Upper Ham Road, Richmond, on the outskirts of London, when on the 10th of November 1976, robber Michael Hart, armed with a sawn-off double-barreled shotgun, threatened the bank clerk, 20-year-old Angela Woolliscroft, and demanded money. In line with the bank's instructions in such circumstances, Angela Woolliscroft pushed a bundle of notes beneath the window. Hart grabbed the £2,000 with one hand, and with the other, raised the gun and pulled the trigger. A murder squad was formed immediately, and a police photographer recorded the scene. Hart's getaway car was found, abandoned in a multi-story car park in Kingston. And careful examination revealed other clues: cigarettes, a briefcase, a false hairpiece, a credit card, etc. The murder squad worked hard, and within 2 months they had arrested Hart. An underwater search unit had recovered from the nearby River Thames what they believed to be the murder weapon. Before bringing it to the surface, they carefully jammed a twig in front of the hammers, just in case the unfired cartridge was still live. But it was the fired cartridge that proved to be the stumbling block in their investigations. The pellets removed from the victim's body were game shot. The cartridges in the gun were quite clearly marked Trap Shot 7. A baffled murder squad called for the firearms expert. Risking the accusation of tampering with court evidence, he opened the unfired trap-shot cartridge. It contained game shot. They took it to the manufacturers, who checked the whole of that production run to find that they had been wrongly labelled. The perseverance of the murder squad gives the investigation, arrest, trial and conviction a well-earned place in the Black Museum. At the Old Bailey, London's Criminal Court of Justice, Michael Hart claimed that the gun had gone off by accident. The jury didn't believe him, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that he should serve not less than 25 years. Whilst awaiting trial, he tried to hang himself. He was unsuccessful. Among the exhibits in the famous murders display is one collection that might best be described as Murder of the Famous, because the victim was a face well known on both cinema and television screens in the 60s and 70s, that of actor Peter Arne. It was on the 1st of August 1983 that police were called to his apartment in Hans Place in London, close to Hyde Park. There was no sign of forced entry, but the entry phone was off the hook, the walls were spattered with blood, Peter Arne's body sprawled in the kitchen doorway. Also in the hallway, that blood-stained log of wood, which is one of the court exhibits, now rests in the museum. Just see if from these and the police scene of crime photographs, you are able to deduce what must have happened on that fateful day. Peter Arne had been battered with this log and this stool. Both carried his blood. But death had been assured by a stab wound from this kitchen knife, which had severed the carotid artery. In the sitting room were 2 cups of coffee on the table, together with a half-eaten jar of honey, a sleeping bag on the floor, together with clothing not belonging to the dead man, but covered in his blood. Peter Arne was a kind man, known to befriend down-and-outs and give them a chance to clean up and enjoy a decent meal. Was it amongst them that his murderer was to be found? Detectives began house-to-house inquiries and discovered several people who had seen a man hanging about in Hans Place, a bearded, scruffy man with flame-red hair. Someone saw him sitting on a step, spooning honey from a jar. The postman recalled a bearded man approaching him who spoke hardly any English, asking what sounded like where Peter lives, but no more than that. A photofit impression of the bearded man was made up and published worldwide. It was shown on a crime television program and was seen by an off-duty river policeman whose boat only that day had been called to recover the naked body of a man from the River Thames. The officer picked up the phone and rang the murder squad. On the banks of the Thames, not far from where the body was recovered, was found a pile of clothing. It too was stained with Peter Arne's blood. At the Westminster Coroner's Court, London, on the 19th of October 1983, a double inquest was held, and the coroner returned a verdict that in case 1, Peter Arne had been unlawfully killed, and in case 2, Italian-born Giuseppe Peruzzi, for that was the drowned man's name, had committed suicide in remorse for having done so. But what on earth had provoked Peruzzi into murdering his benefactor? Could it be that, having enjoyed his hospitality, Peruzzi wanted to prolong it? That, kind man though he was, Peter Arne said that was not possible? That an argument developed? And Peruzzi, not a stable character at the best of times, had grabbed that log of wood from the unlit fire and repeatedly struck Peter Arne? That Peter Arne had tried to escape down the hallway, but followed by an enraged Peruzzi had stumbled and knocked the entry phone from the wall? That from loss of blood he'd staggered or been dragged back towards the kitchen, where Peruzzi had grabbed the first thing to hand and stabbed him with a kitchen knife. And as the pathologist has suggested, Peruzzi continued to batter his victim with the kitchen stool long after he was dead. Is that how you think it happened? Only 2 people know if you are right: Peter Arne and Giuseppe Peruzzi. Heads you win, tails I lose could have been the motto of James Steele, whose photograph stands in the forgery section of the Black Museum. A skilled forger all his life, but at the age of 80 retired from the game, until in 1964 some metal strips from the suppliers to the Royal Mint came into his hands. James couldn't resist the temptation. Out came his old forger's workbench, and into circulation went forged 2-shilling pieces. equivalent to 10 pence in today's coinage. Indistinguishable from the real thing, except, do you know how many cuts there are in the milled edge of a 2-shilling piece? No, neither did James. He was too short, which was why he found himself facing a judge who, with some irony, sentenced him to 2 years' imprisonment. But he didn't even serve that. On grounds of ill health, they let him go. The 2 men who forged these dollar bills 7 years later were sentenced to a somewhat longer time in jail. But that time has been served, the debt paid to society, so we'll just call them simply Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones and concentrate on the crime. They developed an offset lithographic printing process whereby they could print $20 and $50 bills that were virtually undetectable from the real thing. It was only a tip-off that samples were circulating amongst international criminal circles looking for big buyers that sent the counterfeit currency squad at Scotland Yard into action. Ironically, months of inquiries worldwide brought them back to England to raid a house on the outskirts of London belonging to one Charles Smith. They recovered 85,000 of the forged bills, but they still had to find the press. And who was the printer? Strange noises from the garage of an ex-printer, James Jones, sent them on their second raid. The garage had a false front. Inside, the printing press that they were looking for, plus 3.5 million newly printed dollars. But the investigation couldn't end there. Printing plates they had, but where were the all-important negatives from which the plates were made? Many more plates could be made up if they weren't found. James Jones' house was dismantled. No negatives. Smith's house, same treatment. Cupboards, floorboards, walls even. Until a young, keen-eyed detective noticed that this door and its frame had been newly painted, but the hinges were clean. Off came the door, revealing a metal plate along the bottom. Off came the plate, and out came the all-important negatives, foiling the consortium's plan to manufacture 2 million counterfeit dollars a month. At the Old Bailey on the 5th of January 1979, Smith, the ringleader, was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, Jones, the printer, 3. And the young detective, well, he too shall remain anonymous. In January 1911, it was headline news. A simple burglary that became a multiple murder when police were called to a jeweller's shop in Houndsditch in the city of London. As the armed burglars rushed from the shop, they fired wildly at the police. 3 policemen were killed, 2 more were injured. But still, 3 of the gang were arrested. 2 of them escaped to hide in the house in which this man lodged, Peter Piatkov, who, because he painted scenery at the Anarchists Club, had been nicknamed Peter the Painter. The press had a field day. 3 murders, the murderers holed up in a house in London's East End, foreign names, because apart from Peter Piatkov, there was Fritz Vaz and Josef, plus the Anarchists Club. The flavour of revolution was in the air, and the Sydney Street siege had begun to take its place in history. Police closed in on the house, to be met by a hail of bullets, so the army was called in. A detachment of Scots Guards was deployed. The situation was deemed serious enough for the Home Secretary himself to put in an appearance, a man to become famous not for the Sydney Street siege, but for his leadership of Britain in the Second World War. Yes, you have it in one, Winston Churchill. His immediate Churchillian suggestion was to bring up a cannon and blow the front of the house in. It proved unnecessary. Smoke began pouring from the building, and then flames. The fire brigade was ordered to remain behind police lines, and the building was allowed to burn. But all that was found inside were the charred bodies of Vaz and Joseph. Peter Piatkov, Peter the Painter, was nowhere to be seen. But then, of course, there'd been nothing to connect him with the crime anyway, other than the fact that they were his lodgings and he was an anarchist. So the £500 reward remained uncollected, even by the good soul who in 1932 was convinced that she'd seen him in Moscow. A similar call for the army in a similar situation was made by the police officer who introduced this video. Now retired, now Sir John Dello. This note of transfer of command was scribbled hastily outside the Iranian embassy in London, and the troops he'd called for was not a detachment of the Scots Guards, but the SAS. On Wednesday, the 30th of April 1918, a group of armed Iranian dissidents had taken possession of their embassy in Prince's Gate, on the south side of Hyde Park, to gain publicity for their cause, a demand for autonomy for the Khuzestan province on the borders with Iraq. They held 27 people hostage in the embassy, including the ambassador and the man whose uniform, or at least part of it, is now an exhibit in the Black Museum. Police Constable Trevor Locke was on diplomatic protection duty, and the reason for his uniform greatcoat to be in the museum is that it remained the cover for his service revolver throughout the whole of the siege. Diplomatic protection officers are among the few of London's policemen to be armed. As with Sydney Street, the media descended en masse, and space was made within Hyde Park itself for the television camera towers, but none could get closer than the police video unit, who recorded every move made to end the siege. The footage released for the first time for public viewing is what you are watching now on this video. First move was to isolate the terrorists from connection with anyone except the negotiating police officers, to which end the embassy switchboard was cut off and a field telephone was passed in. If for any reason they refused to use it, a senior officer and an interpreter gambled on moving closer to the windows, putting themselves within range of the terrorists' guns. Trevor Locke also acted as intermediary, always correctly dressed, and of course wearing his greatcoat and cap. From time to time a supply of food was placed on the doorstep. The time had not come to employ starvation tactics. The negotiations were going well. A mullah agreed to move in close, to try to persuade them face to face not to carry out their threats to shoot the hostages one by one. Demonstrating Iranians further complicated the situation, and then on the 6th day, shots were heard. The door of the embassy opened, and what was quite obviously a body was bundled out. It was that of Abbas Lavasani, a young press officer, who had only served at the embassy for a week. John Dello made his decision, phoned the Commissioner and the Home Secretary, and then he wrote this note. As the SAS brought people from the blazing building, they were put face down on the grass and their hands bound until they could be identified as either hostage or terrorist. Among them was only one terrorist. The rest were still in the embassy, dead. Before we depart from this particular visit to Scotland Yard's Museum of Crime, our thanks go to the Metropolitan Police for their willing cooperation in the making of this video, and in particular to the now retired Sir John Dello for allowing us behind the scenes to experience just some of the fascinating work of London's police. Young constables for whom training for the future gains from the knowledge of the past, even the distant past, when it was thought that a criminal face existed. The death masks were made of all who were led to the scaffold, and whose sightless eyes now gaze down upon visitors to the Black Museum.